Hello, thank you so much for attending my presentation. Customer feedback is the fuel in our engine. My name is Kevin Hwang. I'll be your host for the next bit of time. I'm currently a documentarian at Splunk in San Jose, California. I'm passionate about coaching, and I'm here to tell you how I use customer feedback to add value to my documentation. I've coached youth sports for over 20 years. Here's some proof in the pudding. On the left, a picture of me with the boys team when we qualified for junior nationals. And on the right, a picture of me with the 14 and under girls team when we also qualified for junior nationals. And you might be wondering, well, how is this related? When you're the coach, you're really finding ways to empower your athletes to improve. It's not a one-way street in terms of I tell you what to do and you do it and that's that. You need to solicit feedback from your athletes and kind of check in regularly with them to see what's working and what doesn't feel right. So a lot of what you do is actually predicated on what the athlete is telling you with their words or what they're showing you with their performance. As a technical writer, customer feedback is the ultimate gauge for how much value your documentation is actually providing. Coaches who can develop strong relationships with their players to help them solve problems and improve are generally deemed to be good coaches. I think in a similar fashion, documentation that helps customers solve problems, improve their performance, and develop community can be labeled good documentation. But none of that can happen without customer feedback. So in this presentation, I'm going to show you how I've used customer feedback to engage and build a relationship with my product community and help to add value to my own documentation. So for most of us as writers, our process follows a very similar kind of path. So before Splunk, I'd actually never worked at a job before where I was able to hear directly from the customers. These high-level steps on this slide should look pretty familiar. Much of what we do fits into one of these buckets. Let's say you need to write a feature about how something works or help a customer solve a problem or teach a customer how to do something. So you begin by hunting and gathering information. You talk to subject matter experts. You get hands-on with a product. You can use Google as a resource. You ask tough questions and you take notes and you write down the answers. Then you begin to write your content and you have your content reviewed. After the review cycle, you make changes, you get it reviewed maybe a second time, maybe a third time. And when you feel like you're done, you publish. And after you publish, you might even have some data to indicate which pages are being visited the most. So you even know how many people are visiting your docs and which pages seem to be most popular. And that's it. You're done, right? After I publish the documentation, there's always a period of kind of anxiety for me because I can't wait to get feedback from the customer who's actually reading it. So for me, documentation is always a living, breathing entity that changes and evolves over time. And the thing that really fuels the change is customer feedback. So what makes documentation valuable? The customer should be able to quickly and easily find what they're looking for. So for example, you might have a Google search appliance or homegrown search engine, or you might even be able to validate the architecture and structure of your docs so that it makes sense. So it's easy for the customer to find what they're looking for. Documentation is valuable if it helps your customers solve a problem. So for example, getting Windows event data into my product or a product that I write about is not a straightforward process. There are many different types of Windows events with different formats. So customers ingest their Windows data and then they don't see the detections that they're expecting to see. So I got together with our professional services team and our data science team and used their input to help craft a document to help them solve this problem. So in using, this is another example of where I use customer feedback to provide additional value to what was there before in the documentation. Valuable documentation helps customers do their jobs more efficiently. So as a writer, you are really one of the experts about your product. Give examples about the best way to use the product to help and solve problems. In this way, the customers also have a better understanding of how to actually use your product. For example, your customers might not know how to create a custom dashboard, or perhaps they don't know that they can create a dashboard and add it to their homepage, or even automatically generate reports off of that dashboard. So these are all small examples of examples that you can show in your documentation that helps customers have a deeper understanding of how to use the product. And it teaches them something new. As a writer, you have the opportunity to not only teach about your product and its features, but also educate your customers as an expert in your particular area. For example, I worked for a company that made load balancers, and for every release, the company would add, a new algorithm or a new type of load balancing that could be configured by the customer. So initially, I was documenting all these different types, and that was fine, and the customers needed to know that. But I also decided that we needed to have more content around why a customer would choose particular types, or maybe even ways to categorize or group the different types of load balancing together. So to tell this story, I had to start at the very beginning and just kind of educate the customers on what actually is load balancing and why do you need to configure it in your network. And then with that background or that foundational piece, then we begin to go down the road of, okay, so now we have these different types of load balancing, and here's why you might choose this one over another one. And so you have an opportunity to kind of educate your customers, not just talk about the features, but kind of provide the feature in a much broader context, so to help the customer understand why they would need one over the other. Qualities that make documentation valuable can't really be quantified by any data. So, if someone is visiting your documentation a lot, how do you know that the documentation is actually helping them to solve a problem or helping them do their jobs more efficiently? The answer is you have them tell you. So why is doc feedback, and why is doc feedback important, and how do we get the most out of it? It's important for many reasons, but I'm just going to highlight on a few to illustrate why or how feedback can help add value to your organization. I feel like that's the most important part of documentation feedback. It's not just, hey, you have a typo, hey, there's some small error or something, but there's tremendous opportunity to add a lot of value to your documentation or to your product or even to your organization. And those are the areas that I want to focus on. So receiving doc feedback actually proves that customers are reading your documentation. This means documentation serves as an important piece of the relationship between your company and your customers. A common way for customers to become disillusioned with a product and its company is to have them think, this product doesn't make sense, or it doesn't work, and I went to the documentation and they don't help either. I can't find what I'm looking for. Customers really need to trust that documentation is accurate and helpful and adds value to the overall product. At Splunk, we've even published a book called The Product is Docs, and it is literally true. The product is unusable without the documentation. So doc feedback can also help you as a technical writer feel closer to the people who are actually using your product to solve problems. And it helps you empathize with those people. Have you ever documented a part of the product, and no matter who you talked to or what words you wrote or what questions you asked, something just didn't feel quite right. If that's ever happened to you as a writer, trust me, it's happened to a customer. So when you get feedback from someone expressing the same frustration that you might have felt before, this is fuel that you can use to go back to your product teams and say, please help us understand this better, or how can we reconsider something about the product or this design? When customers give feedback, they want to know their voice is heard. Having empathy provides clarity in terms of helping to guide potential changes to the product or the documentation. And when these changes occur, the customer knows their voice is making a difference. Sometimes the customer is frustrated, but it's kind of on them. Having someone on the other end respond anyway is so valuable to developing a trust and relationship. Oops, sorry about that. Documentation feedback also can help create a sense of community because chances are there are many other users trying to solve the same problem. There are folks who don't provide feedback even when the opportunity is there. But that doesn't mean they aren't experiencing the same issues or frustrations. It only takes one piece of feedback to prompt a change that could help hundreds of customers reading your docs. At Splunk, I monitor several public Slack channels related to the product that I write for. On a fairly regular basis, I will have one of the following types of interactions with somebody in the community. I can answer a question by providing a link to the docs. Somebody may ask, hey, is the product able to do such and such? And I can respond with yes, and then link them to the documentation that describes how to do what they're trying to do. Or I can, sometimes a question is answered by another expert, and then I can either clarify or add that to the doc. So a customer may ask, I'm trying to do XYZ with the product. Is this possible? Has anybody ever done it before? And then somebody else may answer in the Slack channel and say, yes, this is how you do it. And then I can take that feedback, that procedure, and kind of test it out in my own environment. And if it works, if it's valuable, then I can just go ahead and add it directly to the documentation. Or sometimes something in the docs is not clear, and either I or another customer suggests that the customer should submit feedback on the page because the doc team always follows up. This last example builds a lot of goodwill and strengthens the doc team's presence in the community, in addition to making our documentation stronger. So if your company has any sort of online community or social media in the form of blogs or somewhere on your corporate website, chances are there is chatter about your documentation. Your customers can discuss issues openly with other customers. Imagine the chatter being along the lines of, oh, I had this problem, but I found the answer in the docs. That feels pretty amazing. So doc feedback can also prove and validate the value of your documentation to your executive team. So maybe you're a hiring manager looking to grow a team of writers, and you need to justify the additional headcount. Doc feedback can play a really important role in this specific case. Doc feedback proves that customers actually read the documentation and are using the documentation to help solve their problems. Or perhaps you're responsible for tooling your company's documentation and you have received feedback from your community or your customers asking for maybe a more robust search experience or better performance. Maybe your website is a little bit slow. You can use customer feedback to present your case to your executive team about the importance of growing your documentation in the same way any product develops and evolves over time. Having this direct interaction with customers really helps to fight the outdated stereotype that no one ever really reads the docs, because they do. Customer feedback can be challenging. In the next few slides, we'll take a look at some of the ways that it can be hard, and then I'll offer some solutions that have worked for me. Doc feedback is hard to fit in. One of the main challenges is that there's already a lot of regular work with documenting new features, addressing existing doc feedback, Doc feedback is not something that can be planned for or scheduled until the feedback is actually received. So we're a little bit reactive when it comes to documentation feedback. For example, some weeks I may receive only 2 pieces of feedback. In other weeks, I may receive as many as 7 or 8 or 9. And there's no guarantee that, a busy week of doc feedback won't coincide with maybe a week where we're trying to get a product released or a specific version released. So, it also may not be a priority because maybe the product team has moved on to bigger, newer things. And it's hard to find someone who is willing to spend the time revisiting older stuff. Customers don't always upgrade to the latest version right away. So feedback can be filed against any version of the product that is still available. And there's really no way for us to control that. So another challenge is, potentially the person who implemented the older feature left the company. So a customer files feedback, and it may take some time to find somebody who would be able to go back and revisit something that was designed by somebody who's no longer at the company. Sometimes, there are times when as a writer, you don't know the answer to the customer's question. For example, a customer may say, I want to know if my clustered solution can work if my cluster is spread out across multiple geographical locations. Well, as a writer, maybe you've never tested anything like this on your own, so you would have no way of knowing and no way of providing the answer. So there are some issues with this, as finding the answer may not be that easy. Engineers are busy, and they may not have the time to help you discover the answer. You may not even know who to ask to get the answer. And sometimes there may not even be an answer. For this particular example, it may lead to a discussion about whether or not we even want to encourage or support a configuration such as the one the customer is asking about. Sometimes you don't know, and the product team may not even know. And sometimes the product lies actually in the product, and it's not about anything that you wrote at all. So there was a time when I received feedback asking about a particular option in the user interface. I went to the engineering team and asked, and they responded and said something along the lines of, that really doesn't work, and no one should be using it really. In this case, there's not much you can do. I mean, you just respond to the customer and you kind of let them know and say, hey, this is the situation with this particular feature. And then you have to go back to engineering and ask them to prioritize removing the menu item, because it's likely, this one customer provided feedback and say, hey, we're trying to use this and it's not working. And they're probably not the only one. There might be other customers experiencing the same kind of frustration, but they just didn't submit any feedback. Recently, I've been dealing with an issue where a backup and restore feature is causing issues for customers because the procedure involves lots of manual steps, and it's really easy for them to miss a step. The actual solution, in my opinion, is to have the product take care of this as much as possible, so it's not such a manual procedure for the customer. I have raised this with the product team, and improvements are underway. And I intend to be involved to make sure the customer has a much nicer experience with this feature going forward. So without customer feedback, there's no telling how many customers would have tried to use this option and become frustrated because it doesn't work. So documentation feedback has challenges, but you can do it, and I will kind of give you some examples of some strategies that I've used to help manage my own documentation feedback. So one way you can do it is to group related feedback into buckets. So if you have several pieces of feedback related to the same area, you can group them together and address them simultaneously to avoid having to, context switch often. Then you can use this as fuel to go back to your product teams and provide the data that several customers are struggling with this particular aspect of the product. And then you can have the discussion about whether this is a doc issue or whether this is a product design issue that needs to be examined. You can also have buckets arranged by complexity of the issue. So for example, one bucket can be for items that can be addressed in a day. And you can have a second bucket for topics that may take a few days to address, and then another bucket for kind of bigger things that may involve a cross-functional expert and many different folks from different teams being involved. One of the products that I write for uses data from human resources systems to link detections to actual human users. This data is essential to the product working correctly and giving the customer maximum value by informing the customer not only that there's a potential threat, but who is actually involved. So onboarding human resources data has always been a large pain point for customers because every company has their own way of maintaining this data. For example, some companies use first initial last name for their email addresses, and other companies use first name dot last name. Some companies, when employees leave a company, some companies classify them as inactive, and other companies classify them as terminated. So I've received a lot of feedback from customers, professional services, over the Slack channels about human resources data. So I compiled all of the feedback and was able to raise this as a concern with the product team. And I asked to have dedicated time from professional services folks and the engineering team to help me craft a document that would go a long way towards easing this pain point for the customers. So the document is likely not perfect, but the noise around onboarding human resources data has quieted substantially. So after following up with many of those customers and professional services folks who helped me write the documentation, I was able to validate that the documentation was indeed helpful. So, this is a really great example of how doc feedback kind of provided an impetus to really add value to the documentation in terms of help, identifying a pain point, getting a lot of people involved in a cross-functional effort, and crafting a new doc that provides tremendous value because it helps the customers get past one of the biggest hurdles in terms of getting the product set up and running. Another strategy that I've used is to work with your product teams so you can group the feedback into buckets by priority, and then you can prioritize these. Go to your product team to help prioritize issues that come in. So, for example, many customers might find one thing in the documentation confusing, but solving it would involve getting multiple people together over a period of time. So you could see if this is enough of a priority so that the necessary people do get together and help you address the documentation. The documentation is part of the product, so your product team may help you rearrange the priority of some items so that the necessary subject matter experts or other resources are available to you when you need it. No matter what you decide, keep the customer in the loop. We mentioned it earlier, but customers like to know that their voice is being heard. So when they submit feedback, even if you get back to them with a friendly, hey, it's nice to hear from you, and I'm not sure what the answer to your question is, but I will find out. Give me a week. Communicating with the customer creates a valuable ongoing relationship. Then they know you take feedback seriously, and if you consistently follow through, they are likely to leave more feedback the next time that they encounter an issue. In some cases, they may even leave you fan mail feedback along the lines of, you guys are rock stars and I love what you do. Yes, it actually happens. Those customers are likely more likely to advocate on your behalf in their own communities. They become that customer that encourages other customers to leave feedback. And in turn, those customers will do the same, creating a virtuous cycle of goodwill. You may have had a situation where the customer has asked for something that you won't provide for whatever reason. You let the customer know, and that's that, right? You can also follow up with Is there anything else I can help you with? And give them the chance to end the conversation. You are empowering the customer to have some control over your interaction and make them feel like their voice is being heard. It's also an opportunity to develop a relationship or even learn. Is there anything else I can help you with? One time, I got, you guys always respond so quickly. I responded with, we try our best to, yes, followed by, amazing. I'm going to encourage the rest of my team to leave feedback as well. Or another time, I resolved feedback about supported operating system versions for my product. And then I followed up with, is there anything else I can help you with? After that, the customer and I got into a long discussion about AWS M4 and M5 instant types and which ones he thought were better compared to the ones that we say we actually supported. I did a bit of research that day about these EC2 instance types and learned quite a lot. Real examples of doc feedback used as fuel to add value to documentation. This example shows how customer feedback can really add value to existing documentation. In this case, we have some documentation around the standard architecture of sending events from Phantom directly to Splunk. This is the scenario designed by engineering, and this is how it was tested, it was documented, and signed off after all the subject matter experts and the review cycle had a chance to look at it. Now we have feedback from one of our professional services folks saying that multiple customers are asking about adding a heavy forwarder in between Phantom and Splunk. So the existing documentation falls short of helping the customer find a solution to this particular problem. In fact, there are likely other customers who have the same question who just haven't left any feedback. And this is a case that I would raise to the product team and ask, is this possible? Have we tested it, or can we test it? Is this an architecture that we even want to recommend to other customers? And if so, how can we prioritize testing this and supporting this so that I can let the customers know? Here's another example that would fall in the do it now bucket from one of the earlier slides. The customer has left feedback. They communicated with Splunk support and discovered that a feature is no longer supported in the product. This particular feature was, in fact, one of the first ones that I documented when I joined Splunk. Through various organizational changes, it appears that neither I nor the product team was aware that this feature was either never implemented or never really maintained or never put in production to begin with. So after verifying that this feedback was, in fact, not implemented or no longer implemented, this feedback clearly falls in the do it now, so remove it from the documentation and go to the product team and say, please remove it from the product so customers aren't trying to use it any further. So here's an example where we educate the customer a little bit. So this is an example from a customer who is trying to start Splunk services. And even admitted in their feedback, they say, I am new to Splunk and Linux. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's important to understand that we sometimes make assumptions about our customers, and sometimes those assumptions can create issues. So here, we have to help the customer understand that a certain level of understanding about the Linux operating system is required in order to actually properly install Splunk and start the Splunk services. And this is one of my favorite reasons, favorite things about doc feedback is this customer wrote in and actually addressed me by name. This particular customer was a regular sender of documentation feedback. And I already have developed a relationship with this customer over time, and so they're just very friendly. They write in, "Hey Kevin, I see that there's this issue and it's really cool to receive this kind of feedback. The other part that I like about this feedback in general is this is a product issue and not actually a doc issue. His feedback mentions that there's a couple of missing files that for some reason were not included in the version that he had. So what we had to do is we kind of have to, provide this customer with a patch that included the missing files. But again, my favorite part is that he really trusted me enough so that I was the first person he reached out to, even though this wasn't really a documentation issue, this was a product issue. In conclusion, as any good coach will communicate regularly with their athletes to gauge the value that they are providing, a good technical writer, I think, uses documentation feedback to gauge the value of their documentation. Encourage your Scrum teams to help prioritize customer feedback. It's not always glamorous to go back and revisit old features, but the customer's voice is the essential fuel that adds value to your documentation. Just as products and features are enhanced based on customer feedback, doc feedback should be similarly prioritized for all the reasons mentioned in this presentation. When customers do provide feedback, engage with them and let them know what's happening. Keep them in the loop and give them a chance to end the conversation. Use simple strategies to manage and prioritize the feedback you do receive. Use these strategies to improve the docs, or educate the customer, or educate yourselves, or even improve the product. At Splunk, customer feedback is the fuel that adds value to my documentation. I mentioned earlier about valuable documentation may even inspire customers to leave fan mail, and I'm happy to show you a few examples. Here are a couple examples of short and sweet fan mail that have actually been received by the doc team. And valuable documentation can even lead to inspiring and creative fan mail such as this one. Thank you very much for attending my presentation. If you have any questions, you can find me on Twitter, or you can email me, or you can find me on Slack on the Write the Docs Slack channel. Thank you.
Wow, I don't think I've met anybody who's received fan mail for docs. That's pretty heartwarming.
Yeah, it's a great feeling, and it serves as validation for a lot of the work that we do. It's always good to hear, but to hear directly from customers, I think is pretty special, because a lot of times you hear, from folks within your own org, hey, this is really good job, but to hear that documentation has actually helped the customer solve a problem, I think is a really special feeling.
Yeah, so we a few questions from people, including some questions that came in rather early during your presentation. I'm going to start with the question from Stella Maria. Stella had mentioned that she works in a company where people who are customers facing are deeply reluctant to allow the documentation team anywhere near the customers. So she mentions that they are currently working on trying to overcome this issue, and she's asking if you have any recommendations for how you can actually get that kind of customer feedback that goes beyond there's no documentation for this field, or how do I do X, Y, or Z?
Yeah, at Splunk, I mean, that process was already kind of in place when I joined. So, with respect to my current company, like, I don't know how they started doing that. But they obviously made it a priority to allow customers to write in directly to us, and so that process was already there. But I was at another company earlier where we did sometimes we would have calls with customers, and they would allow writers to sit in. So there still wasn't the direct one-on-one interaction with customers that we really craved. So that's a tough one to answer. I mean, I think the important thing is that the organization needs to prioritize, like, hey, this is valuable data that we're not getting, and then once they kind of establish that, then I think it's kind of up to everybody to figure out like how they want to do it, whether you want to do it as a web form and allow customers to write in, whether you want to set up, face-to-face meetings or calls or Zoom calls, with customers, and just kind of let them give you feedback that way. I've seen it done a lot of different ways, and I think they all kind of work. It just kind of depends on what you're set up for. If you need to kind of build the system from scratch, that could be kind of cost, resource intensive. But if it's a priority and the organization determines that they want it done, then it can happen.
Yeah. The data is there. I guess it's a matter of bringing people's attention to it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
More questions. Another early question from Kathleen. Kathleen had asked if you have any specific beta users, like customers or whom you would ask to take your documentation for a spin.
Yeah, we do. We had a project recently that had a beta program, and as part of that, the early product adoption team, like they would have regular phone calls with customers. So I would always dial in to those and just kind of, hey, did you read the docs yet? How are they? What did you find useful? So I did have that kind of direct interaction with them as well. So it can happen. I mean, especially for betas, it's a really good opportunity to kind of get in early, with the customers and just let them know that, hey, docs are, a writer is available. Please let us know if you have any issues.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay. Question from Coley. Coley asked if you have a researcher who specifically helps gather this sort of feedback, whether it's through conducting interviews or designing feedback metrics.
We do not. So it's just that we have feedback mechanism available at the bottom of every page in our documentation. So the way it works is the customer can just, whatever page they're on, they can just, there's a little form at the bottom, they fill it out and submit. And then we get it. It actually creates a ticket in our system. And then basically the writer who's responsible for that area would just kind of pick up the ticket and respond to the customer. So there isn't anybody on our team that's whose job it is to kind of triage all of those things. It's pretty much up to the writers to be responsible and kind of pick up the tickets that are in their area.
So there's a button and there's a ticketing system.
Right.
Okay. I mean, and on that note, we do have a question from Maria Power. Do you have any tips or advice for adding feedback options to documentation when the software doesn't one? So perhaps when there is no button.
Yeah. I mean, I think I've seen it done a lot of different ways. Like a lot of times you'll see, you'll see like on web pages, was this topic useful? Happy face, sad face, thumb up, thumbs down, that kind of thing. And it's really minimal, and that's great. We obviously have a form, like a free text form, where customers can kind of write additional, like they don't have to say anything. They can just click, this was useful, yes, submit, done. They don't have to say anything. But a lot of times customers will write in with comments. So I've seen it kind of done a lot of different ways. I don't know how our web team does it. That's probably those technical details are beyond me, but you can even set up like HTML forms with just CGI scripting on the back end and just take care of it that way. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. It just depends on, I guess, what resources you have available and how you like to have it done.
Cool. We do have a few more minutes for questions, so if people have more questions, please feel free to type them into our session chat. I thought I would ask a question myself. I liked what you had to say about letting customers end the conversation, and I think you also did some reflection on the possibilities that, the possibilities for where these conversations could go, because I think you mentioned learning a bit about AWS ECS along the way. So I was wondering if you had any other stories. Just wow, it's pretty unexpected.
Nothing quite like that. Like that one sticks out to me in particular because I was not expecting to go down that road, and I did. I mean, there are times when customers who write in frequently, like I don't want to say like personal relationships with them, but first name basis, we know a little bit about each other. Hey, where do you live? How are things going? Sometimes there's just a follow-up. Excuse me, with that on a little bit of a more personal level. Sometimes customers will have questions about, like, they may have roadmap questions, or they may have further discussions. So there's one case where a customer wrote in and said, "Hey, I have a question about this. This doesn't seem right." So I addressed it in the docs, and then is there anything else I can do for you? And then he's like, "Oh yeah, I was just curious. Is your product ever like is this feature or is this thing anywhere on the roadmap? I was just wondering like would it ever be able to do this one day?" And so we kind of have a discussion about the future of the product and things like that. So it can go in a lot of different ways. That's just one of the enjoyable aspects of just kind of having this ability to connect with customers. But yeah, the one about the AWS one was particularly memorable to me because I didn't know anything about it, and so he was just kind of not really persistent, but he was just like, "Hey, but I know you recommend this, but here's what we're doing, and this really works a lot better for us. Do you know anything about this?" I'm like, "No, I don't, but let me learn."
Nice. That's awesome. I guess we've got one last question for the moment from Murray. Murray's asked if you could repeat your Twitter handle and if there's any other way to reach you on the internets.
Yeah, Twitter is at Kevin Hwang, so it's my full name. I think I'm also on the Write the Docs Slack channel, and you can also you can just email me directly at same Kevin YUHWANG@gmail.com.
Cool. Thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and make an announcement because this is our last Q&A for the day. We've got a social event happening on the Spatial platform. It starts at 6 p.m. Central European time. And I'd just like to say thank you to everybody. Thank you to Kevin. Thank you to the rest of our speakers on the main stage and our lightning talk speakers. Thank you all for showing up today. And we'll be back here tomorrow when we've got a job fair along with more lightning talks and along with the unconference. So thank you again, Kevin.